Now, Rina Ladd asked me to what extent Douglas is influenced by German Expressionism and in what way his work departs from his influence, from this influence. Now, this is a very good question, and I think it's very interesting to see how the influence of German Expressionism on Douglas has developed, has vanished for some time, and has come back in the later time. We know that German Expressionism is some period of art that flourished in the beginning of the 20th century. We have those big names like Beckmann, like Nolde, Karl Schmidt-Rottluff, Richter, Kirchner, and even the Nordic artists like Munch belong to that. And this is a way of art, that kind of art that wanted to see the explosion of emotions, the explosion of soul and of mind, and you see a lot of different colors, a lot of different lines, very hectic lines, very black lines surrounding very light and bright colors and so on. And it showed also how much the soul and the mind developed inside you and were brought outside of you. And this is what I did see in Douglas's paintings in the very beginning. Some of these paintings, when I met him in 1974, were still quite light colored, not very bright colored, but still light colored. But by and by, he became a little bit darker in his color field. There were more brownish and blackish colors. There were a lot of lines, mathematical lines, formula, a kind of strings of ecstatic movements and emotions that came out, and they came to the surface of his paintings and especially of his drawings at that time. And by and by, all that became darker and more intense and more dense, and in a way also a little bit more pessimistic. German Expressionism is not pessimistic in its basic background, but it's also not very optimistic. But it shows the expression of life and soul. It shows the ecstasy, and of course some of the philosophers that were important for that was especially Nietzsche, and of course some of the philosophers of the 19th century. They looked into the art of the soul, they looked into psychoanalytic places even before Freud. I found out that his way with Expressionism was very important for him and was a good way to bring him to a way of explore his own soul and his own mind, and to get out all the difficulties of mind and of spirit that you have, not only the artist, but you, the human being at that time had, a conditio humana, a condition of life that was of course very closely connected to the First World War between 1914 and 1918, and also the liberation of the form and the liberation of the colors. And when you saw for the first time pink cows or red skies, they all were there, but they always were very distinctly kind of domesticated by lines, by surrounding lines. And this is something that that Douglas had also taken by that. Later on, he used more and more dark color. He never used any more normal canvas, oil on canvas paintings with a surface, with an elegant surface, but he used mud, he used crippled paper, he used muddied paper, he used sand, he used a lot of different materials in order to make his paintings more a three-dimensional element. He did not like, as he said, this boring, exquisite surface of the oil and canvas paintings. And so a lot of his paintings were overlapping different materials and were combining different materials. His subjects also had changed when he had come back from Germany. in Germany, he was still quite influenced by the lining and by the different forms of mathematical forms, and so as the German expressionists liked very much. But then when he came back with his somber paintings, with his darker paintings, they were full of lines, they were full of movements, they were full of small figures that you really could not so well differentiate, but you saw 2 or 3 subjects coming up, themes coming up, like a fetus in the body of his mother, like a mummy lying in a kind of a coffin, and like dead persons really in a big tension still, and a lot of small arrows that were pierced into the body. Very complicated paintings which showed you really a way into the interior of soul, into the pain that human beings have, into the sorrow, into the labor you have. And there was anything that was optimistic in a way, nothing that was a kind of hilarious thing. It was always a little bit contorted altogether. And this fascinated me, because you could see how intensely the artist used his own insight into the art he had got to know, and into the philosophy, and into the psychology and psychological movement that he had also begun to study and to experience for himself. And I remember that we were sitting quite often in his small studio, or also sometimes just in his living room, having a drink together, or another drink, or a third drink, and just speaking to each other, just discussing. And as I said before, he liked to use new words, kind of neologisms that he invented. And they were always very fascinating, because he spoke about the non-doing of things, about the non-being immersed in other things, with a kind of a strange German words, which I had never heard before, and which I thought, fantastic, this is something you should have known before. And so my meetings with Douglas were always full of inventions, full of surprises. The surprises sometimes were not so good as I had thought they should be. Sometimes we were just immersed in a kind of drinking together. Sometimes we were immersed in the deepest philosophical thoughts. And sometimes we were immersed in the deepest artistic thoughts. And he always showed me his new paintings. He always showed me what he had done and what he had newly acquired and reinvented. So, for example, what I liked very much were those long kind of corpses, kind of dead bodies. They were so much in attention that they bowed above, you know, like a yoga figure. And all those small arrows that were put into the bodies, all this suffering ways of all these sufferings that you could see in the faces of it, the faces that were almost not there. Sometimes the faces that were triangular, sometimes they looked like bandaged persons. And this also reminded me of some of the things that I had seen before, of course. And he also said, of course, this bandaging of the body and of the face, of the head, he reminded him of Van Gogh when he had cut off his ear. And some of those things that you could see were those ways of looking also into Far Eastern philosophy. He was fascinated also by the Zen Buddhism, the Zazen, that means to sit together. And Zazen, to sit together, is also something related to the German movement of Schopenhauer, who himself, once more, is related to the Upanishad, because Upanishadati is the same word that's sitting next to Samban. And this is what we did a lot of time. And maybe you all know this story of the clapping of the one hand, which I cannot do, which is an old and one of the most famous Zen koans, Zen riddles that you have to say, how to clap with one hand. there's a noise, or is there no noise? This is what you could find in the paintings of Douglas. And you could find in there how he wanted to show you also the noiselessness and the loneliness of the human being who kind of habitated his paintings. And very often you had a person in there that looked like a kind of an angular face, looked like a bandaged face. Sometimes you could see that he was kind of hidden in a dark world, hidden in a surrounding which got denser and denser and closed down on him more and more. We have in the German paintings of the post-expressionism a lot of painters that were also very closely related to Douglas in their work. I do not know whether he had met them personally, but of course he knew very well the work of Anselm Kiefer. Actually, Anselm Kiefer is the only painter, the only artist, live art. He was still alive and is already in the Louvre in Paris. Anselm Kiefer uses the same kind of technique. He uses sand, he uses crippled paper, he uses mud, he uses muddied paper, he uses a lot of different surfaces and the different materials to create his huge paintings. And some of the paintings of Douglas remind me very much of Anselm Kiefer. Of course, there's another German artist named Wols, W-O-L-S, who got a lot of influence on him. And I spoke already before about Max Beckmann with his black lines, who was very much influencing Douglas also. I spoke about Munch, the Norwegian painter, with his famous painting The Cry. And of course there's also Alfred Kubin. This is a late 19th, beginning 20th painter and designer, drawer, who did a lot of very dark paintings, very dark pictures, where you could see into the underworld of your own psychology, where you could see into the stream of consciousness in your own world. And I think this was also a big influence on Douglas. Then, of course, there was Franco Clemente, who stayed for some time in Cholamandal. And Clemente was also, and is still also, a painter who likes Buddhist riddles, who likes Buddhist influences, who has got a lot of Buddhist influences. He spoke once about the bell of Shiva, the bell that Shiva uses, the bell, and he said he doesn't have a clapper. And this is exactly what Douglas described with his clap of one hand. There's no sound, there's a soundlessness, there's a voiceless way of looking at things, and nothing shouts out of himself. And this is a difference to German expressionism. There is a lot of shouting, there's a lot of extrovert describing the world, but Douglas is doing, after his first encounter with expressionists, exactly the different thing, the opposite. He's going inside himself and he looks at all those, let's say, dark angles in himself, at all those dark streets that go through his universe. And there you can follow the angular man, the bandaged head. You can follow also the corpses. You can follow the birds that do not sing, but they're the mechanical birds that you have to put on once more. You can follow also the words, and he's very often haunted by words. He invented words, but he also used words, and he still uses words to create his own universe, to create the way how he looks at things. And one of the latest cycles of his work is a cycle about no sound, no answer is coming, about the telephone receiver. And you can see the numbers, you can see the telephone receiver which is open, which hangs down. There's no one on the other end of the line. This is exactly this loneliness that I can see in Douglas's work, and I think this is one of those things that you should
also remember and see when you look at him and when you look at his work. The distorted figures, the suffering people, the colors that show you that they are very unobtrusive colors. There's black and brown, and so many, many lines. Whenever I saw him working, he worked on a small piece of paper or of canvas or of something else, but there were lines and thousands of lines and thousands of lines that were put into that. And some of his paintings got more and more black because all the lines overlapping themselves, making one surface above the other surface, came to a point where you could not really differentiate anymore what he had painted, because it became so dense and so intense. And there's one also remark that I had for myself after some time. We all know the suprematistic paintings by Malevich, the black and white painting. And Malevich said, when I put all the lines that I have all together and put it in one painting, then the painting becomes an entity of white. And when I take all the lines that in all the paintings in the world are there, I take them off, and then it becomes black. And this is the entity of all the of all the lines that you are here, the entity or the non-entity. With Douglas, it is similar, just the other way around. He puts a lot of lines into one painting, into one drawing, and the drawing becomes denser, becomes thicker, becomes incommensurable, not measurable any longer. This is a very famous word by the German poet Goethe. Uncommensurable, incommensurable. You can't measure it out. You can't find it out. And I think this is one of the things that you can see with Douglas too. And one of the last things which was really fascinating for me is one of his series which he called Blind Poet and Butterflies. There you have two different things, one next to the other. Blind poet is someone who doesn't see his way, who doesn't know his way. He doesn't know how to move. He doesn't know what directions he has to go. And he's also embedded in night, embedded in a surrounding that cannot give him any light. He is really immersed in the dark, immersed in the black night. And on the other hand, you have the subtle elements of the butterflies, the very, very fragile animals that you see here, and they show you exactly the opposite. They show you the non-subtlety, the non-darkness, the non-immersed, all those things. So you have an antagonism, a dichotomy of two different works and two different worlds and of two different lives, one next to the other. It's astonishing that one of the great authors, one of the great writers of the 20th century, Vladimir Nabokov, was also a big lover of butterflies, a lepidopterix. And his work is also work that gets into your soul, until your bones even. And this is a little bit what I can also see with Douglas's work. So in order to answer your question, Rina, I think he was immersed in expressionism for a little bit, and then came out of that when he came back to India in 1988 and became a completely different artist, who looked at himself and who looked at his surrounding, but he looked more in his inner surrounding instead of his outer surrounding. And he is still, I think, one of the artists that I know who is one of the most exquisite invader into the soul of the human being and explorer of the soul of the human being, not finding too much which is too positive, but finding the way how to react to it and how to deal with it and how to get along with it. This is what I thought is one of the great art of Douglas.